I hope you are watching my videos and you will get benefiting also from my videos. So I request you to please like, share and subscribe my video and push the bell icon so that you will get the earliest notification of my video and the upcoming exam also. So today I will cover MG6 American Literature of Block 5 Unit 1, that is background. So today I will go Block 5 Unit 1, that is background. Here it is the structure, objectives, introduction, Whitman's life and works, Dickinson's life and works. Let us sum up chronology, questions and suggested readings. So today I will cover this block 5 of MG6 American Literature and Whitman's life and works and Dickinson's life and works. Here it is the very important. So today I will cover these aspects. So please tune to my videos and watch from first to end and like, share and subscribe. So here it is the objectives. So already we know every unit has its own objective. So this unit has also its own objective. So what is that objective? Our primary objective in this unit is to give you an idea of the background, both historical and literary, that shaped Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson as major voices of 19th century American poetry. So here it is the introduction. Helen McNeil has said in her excellent study Emily Dickinson, if Walt Whitman is the American poet of wholeness, Emily Dickinson is the American poet of what is broken and absent. Okay, so here it is the main key point you can note down. Who told this about Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman? Helen McNeil. Okay, so Helen McNeil has said in her earliest excellent study, that is Emily Dickinson, if Walt Whitman is the American poet of wholeness, it's a whole completeness in her poetry, in his poetry, while Emily Dickinson is the American poet of what is broken and absent. So what is broken and totally absent, that part was written by Emily Dickinson. So wholeness was written by Walt Whitman and broken and absent part of the poem was written by Emily Dickinson. So there is no wonder that Whitman is preoccupied with the larger issues of liberty, equality and fraternity in the mid-19th century America, in which the Civil War 1861-65 posed a grave threat to the unity and cohesion of the nation. So that time was the struggling period and Walt Whitman faced many adverse situations like liberty, equality, fraternity in mid-19th century America. That is 1861-65. The period is most important. You should remember what is the Civil War period, that is 1861-65. The pose a grave threat to the unity and cohesion of the nation. The Civil War ended in the victory of the northern states of the nation and defeat of the southern states. Okay, so Civil War ended in the victory of northern states of the nation and defeat of southern states. The passion aroused by the Civil War led to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the 18th President of the Union. It is appropriate that when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed. Okay, so it is appropriate that when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, 1865-66 is one of the most moving poems ever written by Whitman. When Abraham Lincoln assassination was occurred, so that time Walt Whitman wrote a poem, that is when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed. Okay, when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, 1865-66 was the poem, and it is a passionate elegy in which the poet has described the journey of Lincoln's coffin across the length and breadth of the nation. Okay, so it is a passionate elegy which is written by Walt Whitman, and it is the mourning of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the 18th President of America. One can safely say that Whitman is a poet of American democracy and along with liberty and equality it was fraternity, the ideal of human brotherhood that emerges as the core of his poetry. So here Emily Dickinson is another part that is absent or broken part was written by Emily Dickinson. So how we will study that is Emily Dickinson is however preoccupied with the plight of the individual, particularly a woman brought up in Puritanism dominated New England. Her poems are fragments that illuminate the dark corners of a female who led a rather secluded life, and there is no wonder that out of 1775 poems that are included in her definitive edition edited by Thomas H. Johnson, only 7 were published in her lifetime. So, what are the number of the poems which was written by Emily Dickinson? Here it is the number of poems is 1775 poems, and as the definitive edition edited by Thomas H. Johnson, only 7 were published in her lifetime. While Whitman died as the greatest poet of America, Emily Dickinson was nearly unknown at the time of her death. So Whitman's life and works. Walt Whitman 1819 to 92 was born on Long Island where his early life was passed. While his father was a free thinker from England, his mother was a Dutch Quaker who was an intensely religious person and believed that every person was guided by guided an inner light. So her mother was very pious, that is a Dutch Quaker, and father was a very free thinker from England, and his mother was an intensely religious person. Okay, so person guided by inner light. From 1823 to 1833, his family moved to Brooklyn, where Whitman had some years of formal schooling. Later on, Whitman broke out of the classroom and served a printer's devil. Okay, so later on, Whitman broke out of the classroom and served as printer's devil, journeyman compositor, and also as a school teacher. The sitting jobs is an accurate reflection of a typical American trait, a quest for a meaningful vocation. From 1838 to 1839, he edited The Long Islander. Okay, from 1838 to 1839, he edited The Long Islander. Apart from his journalistic activity, okay, so apart from his journalistic activity, he also read avidly the Bible, Shakespeare, Ocean, Scott. Apart from his journalistic activity, he also read avidly Bible, Shakespeare, Ocean, and Scott, Homer, and something from of the Greek and Hindu poets. His reading also reflected his intellectual curiosity and keenness to assimilate the ways towards both of Europe and Asia. This kind of an exploration of the Western classics and Eastern lore is also found in other members of the American Renaissance like Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, and Mark Twain. So here it is the main key point you can note down, that is his readings also reflected his intellectual curiosity and keenness and the works both of Europe and Asia. So here it is a very important point. His was works both of Europe and Asia, the kind of exploration of Western classics and Eastern lyric. Okay, Eastern lore and Western classics. So another some name that was written that is found other members, that is American Renaissance like Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, and Mark Twain, also Eastern and Western Eastern mix of their writings. So here it is Walt Whitman is a picture of Walt Whitman and Lucia Van Welser Whitman. So Whitman's birthplace West Hills, New York. Then here is a background Whitman's schoolhouse in Woodbury, Long Island. Whitman's stay in Brooklyn and New York brought him in touch with party politics, and he was associated with newspapers and magazines of the Democrats. He also contributed poems and stories to Democratic Review 1841 to 45, and much of his writings at this point of time were conventional, mediocre, and sentimental. Later on, he became the editor of Brooklyn Eagle, which was the newspaper of Democratic Party in 1846. Later on, he became the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle, which was the newspaper of Democratic Party in 1846. While Democratic Party took a pro-slavery stand, Whitman did not defend slavery, but he also could not support the mad fanaticism of the ultra-abolitionists who wanted slavery to be abolished at one stroke by the President of the Union. So here it is the main key point you can note down. Walt Whitman was not supported to slavery. So Whitman did not defend slavery, but he also could not support the mad fanaticism of the ultra-abolitionists who wanted slavery to be abolished at one stroke by the President of the Union. The party establishment wanted the Brooklyn Eagle to accommodate both the pro and anti-abolitionist stands purely from a commercial angle so that the circulation may not go down drastically. For refusing to toe the practical line adopted by the party establishment, Walt Whitman was sacked as the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle. This was Whitman's first encounter with party establishment, and there is no wonder that Whitman began to hate party politics and began to take an independent radical stand on the issue of slavery. This was Whitman's first encounter with party establishment, and there was no wonder that Whitman began to hate party politics and began to take an independent radical stand on the issue of slavery. So here it is Winter Scene in Brooklyn 1817 to 20 painted by Francis Guy. So American poetry. In February 1848, Whitman went to New Orleans with his brother Jeff, who was the most intimate with him in a large family of 9 brothers and sisters. So in February 1848, Whitman went to New Orleans with his brother Jeff, who was the most intimate with him in a large family of 9 brothers and sisters. He also became the editor of the New Orleans Crescent for 3 months. Later on, he returned to Brooklyn. He came via St. Louis, Chicago, and upstate New York and saw something of the frontier and the harsh life of the pioneers. It was an experience that affected him strongly. He also edited various newspapers, including the Brooklyn Times. His prolonged stay in Brooklyn also gave him an idea of the sights, hurry, and bustle of metropolis that is New York, the commercial center of the New World. It was in the metropolis that Whitman became intimate with the drivers of omnibuses and ferry boat pilots, the crowds at the beaches, and the political orators charged with partisan politics. He also indulged in his passion for Shakespeare's plays and Italian opera. As a young man, he used to put on the airs of a dandy, but later on he began to look more rough and unpolished. It was in this frame of mind that he published Leaves of Grass in 1855. It consisted of 12 poems and a critical preface. Song of Myself is a long, rambling poem that figures in the first edition of Leaves of Grass. Many critics admired the originality and vigor of the anthology, but some critics were also disgusted with the explicit sex portrayal and denounced the work as an immoral book. So many critics admired the originality and vigor of the anthology, but some critics were also disgusted with the explicit sex portrayal and denounced the work as an immoral book. So Myself is a long song of myself is a rambling poem that figures in the first edition of Leaves of Grass. So many critics admired originality and vigor of the anthology, but some critics were also disgusted with the explicit sex portrayal. So here it is the main key point. You can note down Leaves of Grass and Song of Myself, and many critics admired the originality and vigor of anthology, and some critics also disgusted with the explicit sex portrayal. So controversy apart, Leaves of Grass is an anthology that is the magnum opus of Whitman's character as a poet. There is no wonder that the poet went on revising and enlarging it. Leaves of Grass is in free verse and is devoid of traditional rhyme and meter. So Leaves of Grass is in free verse and is devoid of traditional rhyme and meter. Emerson greeted the publication of Leaves of Grass and lauded Whitman, the first authentic poet of the New World. Whitman published an enlarged second edition in 1856 and the third edition in 1860. It's strange that initially The poet was not much affected by the Civil War 1861 to 65 that rocked the Republic, but it was the wounding of his brother in the Civil War. So his brother's name was, so here in this paragraph we have read his brother's name was Jeff. Okay, so New Orleans with his brother he moved. So brother's name was Jeff. So controversy apart, Leaves of Grass is an anthology that is the magnum opus of Whitman's character as a poet. There is no wonder that the poet went on revising and enlarging it. Leaves of Grass in free verse. So already we have studied. So the poet was, it is strange that initially the poet was not much affected by the Civil War 1861 to 65 that rocked the Republic, but it was wounded of his brother in Civil War that roused his strong emotions. He went to Washington and became an unofficial nurse to northern and southern soldiers in the army hospitals. It was the agony and suffering of the soldiers that seared and corroded Whitman's soaring idealism and optimism. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated after the end of the Civil War, Whitman was thoroughly shaken and he wrote his most popular lyric, "O Captain, my Captain," and one of his major poems, "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." The latter is an unforgettable elegy mourning the martyrdom of Abraham Lincoln. For a short time, Whitman worked as a clerk in the Indian Bureau of the Department of the Interior, but was dismissed by the Secretary of the ground that he was the notorious author of an immoral book like Leaves of Grass. In 1867 and 1871, Whitman issued two new editions of Leaves of Grass. His prose work Democratic Vista II appeared in 1871. It was in 1871 edition of Leaves of Grass that Passage to India was included. It is perhaps the last major poem by Whitman in which there is soaring vision of the entire globe, fusing the spiritual wisdom of the East with the materialism and technology of the West. Whitman suffered from a paralytic stroke in 1873, which was perhaps the result of an infection during his work in the army hospital. During the last 19 years of his life, Whitman lived a quiet life at Camden, New Jersey. He also brought out the last edition of Leaves of Grass in 1889. He also went to Boston and met his mentor Emerson, whom he still revered in spite of strong differences. Before his death, Whitman had covered a national celebrity and the unquestioned birth of American democracy and received many visitors from abroad. His death led to a remarkable mourning and wave of sympathy in the nation and also abroad. Then we will go Dickinson life and works. So here it is Dickinson, Emily Dickinson's picture. You can see Emily as Lavinia remembered her. Okay. So here it is Emily Dickinson's picture. So Emily Austen and Lavinia Dickinson 1840 and Edward Dickinson. Emily Dickinson 1830 to 86 was the daughter of Edward Dickinson, who was a prominent lawyer of Amherst. Okay, so he was the daughter of Edward Dickinson and who was a prominent lawyer of Amherst, Massachusetts, and Emily Norcas. Since her mother became a bedridden invalid, Emily Dickinson confessed she had no mother. It was Edward Dickinson, her strong and dominating father, who tended to both father and mother to the child. He was such a stern and authoritarian father that he did not permit Emily Dickinson to study at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary for more than a year 1847 to 48. Okay. So he was such a stern and authoritarian father. So he did not permit Emily Dickinson to study at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary for more than a year 1847 to 48. Like Mrs. Malaprop in Sheridan's The Rivals, Edward Dickinson also believed that too much education was not becoming for a young woman. So like Mrs. Malaprop in Sheridan's The Rivals. Okay, so like Mrs. Malaprop in Sheridan's The Rivals, Edward Dickinson also believed that too much education was not becoming for a young woman. Okay, so like Mrs. Malaprop in Sheridan's The Rivals. Okay, so here it is the main key point you can note down. Like Mrs. Malaprop in Sheridan's The Rivals, Edward Dickinson also believed that too much education was not becoming for a young woman. It led to the growth of female assertiveness and also caused a kind of discord and dissension in the family. Therefore, there is no wonder that Edward Dickinson also commanded his daughter not to go out of the homestead which he had repurchased in 1855. As a young woman, Emily Dickinson asserted that she would not go out of the homestead ever. She even refused to go to the church, which all women, old and young, were encouraged to visit. Okay, so here it is the American poetry, Emily Dickinson's Room and the Homestead, East Facet. Thus began a life of utmost seclusion and introversion for young Emily Dickinson. She was, however, attached to her brother Austin and his wife Sue. She also cultivated a number of intense intellectual companions. The first of them was Benjamin F. Newton, who was a law student in her father's office. It was he who introduced her to many stimulating books and authors and also urged her to take seriously her vocation as a poet. It was Benjamin F. Newton who introduced her to the writings of Emily and Charlotte Bronte and also to the writings of a feminist Lydia Maria Child. The young man also presented to Emily Dickinson with a copy of Emerson poetry in 1849, just 2 years after publication. Walt Whitman was, however, considered too immoral and a wicked poet for a young woman like Emily Dickinson. Okay, so Walt Whitman was, however, considered too immoral and wicked poet for a young woman like Emily Dickinson. The early death of her first literary mentor as a result of TB was a great shock to the young woman, and one could sense the rationale behind her lifelong preoccupation with death. Later on, she developed an intense relationship with Reverend Charles Wordsworth of Philadelphia, whom she met in 1854. Okay, so later on, she developed an intense relationship with Reverend Charles Wordsworth of Philadelphia, whom she met in 1854. She began to regard the priest as her dearest early friend, and in her early poetry, she created the image of the lover whom she knew only through her imagination. Wordsworth's removal to San Francisco in 1862 marked a turning point in Emily Dickinson's life. From 1862 onwards, her withdrawal from the life of Puritan community in New England was nearly absolute, and critics are of the view that from 1862 to 1865 there was a remarkable upsurge of her creativity as a poet. So, from 1862 onwards, her withdrawal from the life of Puritan community in New England was nearly absolute, and critics are of the view that from 1862 to 1865 there was a remarkable upsurge of her creativity as a poet. So, from 1862 onwards, her withdrawal from the life of the Puritan community in New England was nearly absolute. And critics are of the view that from 1862 to 1865 there was a remarkable upsurge of her creativity as a poet. Since her poems were not meant for publication and were only her letters to the world, since her poems were not meant for publication and were only her letters to the world, it is not possible to date them with any degree of accuracy. Okay, since her poems were not meant for publication and were only her letters to the world, it is not possible to date them with degree of accuracy. Yet there is adequate evidence that during 1862 to 1865, Emily Dickinson wrote nearly 300 of her approximately 1700 and odd poems. Although the publication of her poems was far from her mind, Emily Dickinson, however, had a budding poet's craving. to find out if her poems were alive. On April 15, 1862, she wrote a letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a professional man of letters, to find out whether her verses breathed. Okay. On April 15, 1862, she wrote a letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a professional man of letters, to find out whether her verse breathed. Higginson had been a Unitarian minister in Worcester who had resigned from the church and taken up writing literary criticism as a career. He had written the letter to a young contributor as the lead article in the Atlantic Monthly for April. Emily Dickinson sent a couple of unsigned poems to Higginson and wanted to know if her poems had genuine literary worth. Higginson sent her a reply asking her to send some more poems, inquiring her age, her reading, her companions, and further details about her writing. However, Higginson's advice to James T. Fields, the editor of Atlantic, was that the poems were not good enough for publication. They were too raw and fragile to be published in a popular venture like the Atlantic. Emily Dickinson, however, continued to exchange letters with her third literary mentor. The conventional literary taste of Higginson strengthened her resolve to keep her poems unpublished. She went on writing feverishly and kept her poems in packets, away even from eyes of her brother Austin and sister Lavinia. She went on writing in her own unconventional way and absence of the response of readers. Okay, so she went on her writing in her own conventional way, and the absence of response of readers gave her the freedom to stick to her individual style. She was, however, indebted to Higginson for the intellectual companionship and invited him to Amherst. She wrote to him, "You are not ever," she said, "that you saved my life. To thank you in person has been since then one of my few requests." Introduction to the poems of Emily Dickinson, edited by Thomas H. Johnson, the Belknap Press, Harvard University Press, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1977, 6th printing. Okay, page number 1104. So here it is, Sealords of Dickinson family, 1847. Okay, so Sealords of Dickinson's family, 1847. Emily Dickinson's white dress and Sealords of Dickinson family, 1847. So it is unfortunate that when Emily Dickinson died in 1886, she had published only 7 poems, all anonymously. Emily Dickinson by Donna Dickinson's Birds, Leamington Spa or Dover NH or Heidelberg, 1985, page number 97. While Higginson was of the view that her poems were too raw and fragile poems to be published in the Atlantic, Emerson was of the view that she wrote as if she was suffering from fever. Perhaps she was born too soon, and it was only after her death that she got recognition. There is no wonder that 5 years after her death, her first book of poems went through 6 printings in 6 months. Okay, so there is no wonder that 5 years after her death, her first book of poems went through 6 printings in 6 months. 12 years later, her poems were translated into German. By 1920, she had become one of the greatest poets of American literature. So let us sum up. Walt Whitman was a poet of American Republic, and he celebrated both the freedom of the individual and also the community of workers and artisans. Emily Dickinson was a lady born in aristocratic family of Amherst, and due to her intense love-hate relationship with an authoritarian father, chose a life of utmost seclusion. While Whitman achieved a degree of fame and odium as well in his life, Emily Dickinson was practically unknown during her lifetime. It was only after her death that she got recognition. Okay, here it is the chronology. The sequential chronology means sequence, and it is the documentary sequence of the year and works or achievements of Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. So we will study. So what is the achievements and in which year he achieved what? So Walt Whitman 1789, Walter Whitman, the poet's father, born. 1795, Louisa Van Welser, the poet's mother, born. 1816, Walt Whitman and Lucia Van Welser married. 1818, a brother, Jesse Whitman, born. 1819, Whitman born in West Hills, Huntington, Long Island on 31st May. 1821, a sister, Mary Elizabeth Whitman, born. So 1819, Walter Whitman born in West Hills, Huntington, Long Island on 31st May. 1821, sister, Mary Elizabeth Whitman, born. 1823, sister, Hannah Louisa Whitman, born. Moves to Brooklyn with his family in 1823. Then 1825, attends the public schools. 1827, a brother, Andrew Jackson Whitman, born. 1829, a brother, George Washington Whitman, born. 1830, leaves the public schools. 1831, joins the staff of Long Island Patriot. 1834, a brother, Thomas Jefferson Whitman, born. 1835, moves to New York City. 1836, moves to Hampstead, Long Island, and begins teaching school. So here it is the main key point you can note down. 1835, moves to New York City and moves to Hampstead, the Long Island, and begins teaching school. Okay, so 1838, begins newspaper career by serving as publisher and editor of Long Islander. Then 1839, moves to Jamaica, Long Island, works on Long Island Democrat. 1849, returns to New York City and works for various newspapers. 1842, Franklin Evans, a temperance novel, published. Then 1843, edits New York Statesman. 1844, edits New York Democrat. 1845, edits Long Island Star. Moves to Brooklyn. 1846, edits Brooklyn Daily Eagle. 1848, visits New Orleans and works on New Orleans Daily Crescent. Edits Brooklyn Daily Freeman. Then 1855, Leaves of Grass, published by Fowler and Wells in New York. Father dies on 11 July, that is 1855. So when Leaves of Grass was published, that is 1855, here it is the main key point you can note down. Leaves of Grass was published on 1855. 1856, Leaves of Grass, published by Fowler and Wells in New York. Then 1857, edit Brooklyn Daily Times. 1859, dismissed as editor of Brooklyn Daily Times. 1860, Leaves of Grass, published by Thayer and Eldridge in Boston. 1862, visits hospitals in Brooklyn to help Civil War wounded. Goes to Washington to find his brother George wounded in battle. So here it is the main key point you can note down. 1862, visits hospital in Brooklyn to help Civil War wounded and goes to Washington to find his brother George wounded in battle. Then 1863, secures an appointment as a copyist in the paymaster's office, begins visit to wounded soldiers in Washington hospitals. 1864, returns to Brooklyn. 1865, Drum Taps and Democratic Vistas, published. So here it is the main key point you can note down. The Drum Taps and Democratic Vistas, published in 1865 by Walt Whitman. Okay, so he returns to Washington and works as a clerk in Interior Department. 1865, hired by James Harlan, new Secretary of Interior, but secures appointment in Attorney General's office. Then 1866, William Douglas O'Connor publishes The Good Grey Poet of Vindication in defense of Whitman. So 1866, William Douglas O'Connor publishes The Good Grey Poet of Vindication in defense of Whitman. So 1866, William Douglas O'Connor publishes The Good Grey Poet of Vindication in defense of Whitman. Okay, so 1867, Leaves of Grass, published by William Chaplin in New York. John Burroughs publishes the notes on Walt Whitman as poet and person. 1868, poems edited by William Michael Rossetti, published in England. 1879, Leaves of Grass, published by J.S. Redfield in New York, passes to India after all, not to create, only published. So here it is the main key point. Passage of India after all. Passage to India and after all. Leaves of Grass was published by J.S. Redfield in New York, that is 1871. Then 1872, Leaves of Grass pirated and published by John Camden Fortin in England as a strong bird on pioneers, pre-published. 1873, Whitman suffers a stroke. On 23rd January, mother dies on 23rd May, leaves Washington for Camden, New Jersey. 1874, Whitman's position in Washington terminated. So, 1876, Leaves of Grass published by Whitman in Camden. Memoranda during the war and tour rivulets published. 1879, Leaves of Grass published in an unauthorized reprinting by Worthington in New York. 1880, Summers and Richard Murray's book in London, Ontario. 1881, Leaves of Grass published by James R. Osgood in Boston but withdrawn from sale by the publisher from after Attorney General of Massachusetts declared the book obscene. Okay, so 1881 the book declared was obscene. Okay, so 1881, Leaves of Grass published by James R. Osgood in Boston but withdrawn from sale by publisher after Attorney General of Massachusetts declares the book obscene. Then lectures on Lincoln before the St. Botolph Club in Boston. Then 1882, Leaves of Grass published by Walt Whitman in Camden, then by Rhys Wells in Philadelphia, then by David Mackay in Philadelphia. Specimen Days and Collect published. 1883, Richard Morris book publishes Walt Whitman. 1884, buys house on Mickle Street in Camden. 1886, Leaves of Grass published by Walter Scott in England. 1887, Specimen Days in America published by Walter Scott in England. 1888, Complete Poems and Prose published by Whitman in Philadelphia, limited to 600 copies. November, books published Democratic Vistas and other papers published by Walter Scott in London. So, Complete Poems and Prose published by Whitman in Philadelphia. Then Democratic Vistas and other papers published by Walter Scott in London. Suffer a stroke in June. Then 1889, Leaves of Grass published by Whitman in Philadelphia, limited to 300 copies. 1891, Goodbye My Fancy published. Okay, so here it is the main key point you can note down. The Complete Poems and Prose published by Walt Whitman is 1888, that is 600 copies. And 1889, Leaves of Grass published by Walt Whitman Philadelphia. Then 1891, Goodbye My Fancy published. Okay, 1891, Goodbye My Fancy published. 1892, Leaves of Grass published by David Mackay in Philadelphia. Walt Whitman dies on 26th March. So 1892, Walt Whitman was died on 26th March 1892. Then Emily Dickinson. 1830, 10th December, Emily Dickinson born in Amherst, Mass, second child after Austin. 1829 to 95 of lawyer Edward Dickinson and Emily Norcross Dickinson. Dickinson's living in the homestead built by Edward's father Samuel Fowler Dickinson. 1833, Lavinia Dickinson, sister born. 1835, Edward Dickinson appointed treasurer of Amherst College. 1836, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 82, publishes essay Nature. Here is the main key point you can note down. 1836, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 82, publishes essay Nature. Then 1837, Great Panic, thousands ruined in American business collapse. 1839, Margaret Fuller initiates female intellectual conversion meetings in Boston, which continue until 1844. So 1840, grandfather Dickinson having moved to Ohio, Edward Dickinson sells his half of the homestead and moves his family to another house in Amherst. Emily and Lavinia enter to co-educational Amherst Academy. Emerson co-founds magazine The Dial 1840 to 44 with Fuller, prepares essays and first series publication 1841. So 1840, grandfather Dickinson have moved to Ohio. Edward Dickinson sells his half of the homestead. Here it is a main key point you can note down. That is 1840, grandfather Dickinson having moved to Ohio. Edward Dickinson sells his half of the homestead and moves his family to another house in Amherst. Okay, so grandfather Dickinson having moved to Ohio. Edward Dickinson sells his half of the homestead and moves his family to another house in Amherst. Emily and Lavinia enter co-educational Amherst Academy. So Emerson co-founds magazine The Dial 1842-1844 with Fuller prepare essays and first series publication 1841. 1842, Edward Dickinson elected state senator in Massachusetts, elected again in 1843. Then 1845, Fuller's influential feminist tract Woman in the 19th Century published. Mexican-American War until 1848, Texas joins U.S. Other Mexican territory annexed at the end of war. 1846, religious revival in Amherst. Emily has already been expressing doubt to her more pious friend Abijah Root. Emerson's poems published. 1847, religious revival in Amherst. Then 1847, Emily enters Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in September. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte published. So here it is the main key point you can note down. 1847, Emily enters Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in September, and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte 1816 to 55 was published under pseudonym of Currer Bell. Then 1848, August, Emily withdrawn from Mount Holyoke by father. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights published. Then December, Emily Bronte dies. Seneca Falls Declaration marks beginning of America's women's rights movement. Seneca Falls Declaration marks beginning of American women's rights movement. 1849, publication of Kavang, popular romance novel by poet Henry Wordsworth. Longfellow secretly given to Emily by her brother Austin. So publication of Kavang, popular romance novel by poet Henry Wordsworth. Longfellow secretly given to Emily by her brother Austin. 1850, another religious revival in Amherst. Edward Dickinson, Susan Gilbert and Lavinia Dickinson join First Church of Christ. Health of mother Emily Dickinson begins to decline. Publication of the Scarlet Letter, a romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. That is 1804 to 1864. That is 1850, another religious revival in Amherst. Edward Dickinson, Susan Gilbert and Lavinia Dickinson join First Church of Christ. 1851, Emily and Lavinia travel to Boston. Herman Melville, 1819 to 91, publishes Moby Dick. Okay. Then 1852, Edward Dickinson, conservative Whig Party candidate elected to U.S. House of Representatives. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin published in book form. So here it is a main key point you can note down. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin published in book form. That is 1852, Edward Dickinson, conservative Whig Party candidate elected to U.S. House of Representatives, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin published in book form. Then 1853, Amherst Belchertown Railroad opens, promoted by Edward Dickinson. 1854, family visits Washington. Walden, A Life in the Woods by Henry David Thoreau, 1816 to 62 published. 1855, Emily and Lavinia visit Washington and Philadelphia. Edward Dickinson repurchases entire homestead and returns family to paternal home. Defeated in election in November, starts new law partnership with son Austin. Mother Emily Dickinson begins to weaken. Henceforth, Emily and Lavinia runs household, supported by domestics. And Walt Whitman, 1819 to 92, publishes Leaves of Grass, and Charlotte Bronte dies. Here it is the background, the front door of Dickens' homestead and the evergreens. 1856, Austin joins the First Church, marries Susan Gilbert, Emily's closest friend. and Austin and Sue moved into evergreens built for them by Edward Dickinson next to the homestead. 1857 Emerson lectures in Amherst, stays with Austin and Sue. Emily does not attend. Elizabeth Barrett Browning publishes her long narrative poem Aurora Lake. Then 1858 Emily is writing poetry seriously, perhaps writes first master letter. 1859 Emily meets Catherine Scott, later Anthon, a friend of Sue and considers her close friend until 1866. 1860 Edward Dickinson declines nomination for Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts on conservative constitutional union right ticket. Then 1861 Springfield Republican respected Western Mass. 1862 Springfield Republican publishes safe in their alabaster chambers. 1863 February 1 Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation frees the slaves. Then 1864 two more poems by Emily printed. Emily in Boston, 7 months for treatment of eyes. 1865 by the end of the year Emily has written about 1,000 poems. Avril General Lee, Confederate Commander-in-Chief, surrenders. Lincoln assassinated. 1867 Austin supervises construction of new First Church opposite Evergreens. Edward Dickinson gives dedicatory speech in 1868. 1870 Emily meets Higginson, who finds the visit exhausting. Family friend J.G. Holland becomes founding editor of important literary magazine. 1872 Edward Dickinson resigns Amherst treasuryship. Then 1873 Edward Dickinson elected to Massachusetts House of Representatives. 1874 Edward Dickinson dies suddenly in Boston. 1875 Mother Emily Dickinson, henceforth bedridden with paralysis. 1876 Helen Hunt Jackson, Amherst born poet and novelist who has become Emily's friend and correspondent. And French urges Emily to publish George Sand, French woman novelist. 1878 by now Emily has written over 1400 poems, some in Amherst Think Jackson pseudonymously published. Sex Home Stories are by Emily, and Emily's success is counted sweetest. Published anonymously in a masque of poets, no name series after Jackson's urging is thought by many to have been written by Emerson. Samuel Bowles dies. 1881 July President Garfield shot dies 19th September. 1882 April Trevor Charles Wordsworth dies. And Austin Dickinson and Mabel Loomis stopped to begin love affair. 1883 nephew Gilbert Dickinson dies. 1884 March George Lord dies. 1885 Helen Hunt Jackson dies. 1886 May 15 Emily Dickinson dies of kidney disease. First selection of her poems published 4 years later in 1890, edited by Thomas Wentworth Dickinson and Mabel Loomis Todd. First collected poems followed by 1955, edited by Thomas H. Johnson. Here is the question. Why was Whitman cited as the editor of Brooklyn Eagle? How did the critics react to Leaves of Grass? How did the Civil War affect Walt Whitman? Who are the literary mentors of Emily Dickinson? Why did Emily Dickinson live such a secluded life? So here it is a suggested reading. You can read. Okay. So already I have covered the block for Unit 1 Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson's life and his works. So you go through the videos from first to end so that you will get each and every key points and keynotes which will help you in your exam. So thank you viewers.